In a previous video from 2021, I tried my hands at building a smartphone out of Lego. This attempt was a shot in the dark for me, and I was glad it could even power on, let alone function. I want to try my hands at a DIY Lego phone too, but this time I want the phone to look a little more like a traditional phone, although it'll still be huge in its Lego-like appearance. I'll see what I can come up with next. For this build, I decided to get an idea of what was possible with Lego blocks by using Lego Digital Designer to design a prototype shell for my DIY Lego phone 2. Using LDD to design the prototype through software really sped up the process of finding blocks. The beauty of using software to search for Lego blocks that are organized by the software is it avoids physically digging through a tub of random Lego blocks searching for the pieces one by one. Another helpful feature of LDD is its ability to create an inventory list of the Lego pieces used for the project on the screen. On screen is my list of pieces needed for a very basic draft of my Lego phone shell. It's not designed to the correct size yet, since I don't know what phone I'll be using. When I do have a phone, the adjustment to the design should be easy to make. I decided to use one of my spare Samsung Galaxy A11 phones for this customization. It's one of Samsung's less expensive phones, so I don't mind sacrificing it for this project. I'm also familiar with this phone because I currently use it daily. As in my last Lego phone video, I'm tearing down the phone into its basic parts, which are the screen, the internals, the battery, and the rear cover. Since the idea behind building a Lego shell is to replace the existing phone's shell, once the teardown is complete, the unnecessary shell parts that are no longer needed can be used as spare parts. For my phone, and probably most, the rear cover would be one of these eliminated parts. Because this is a budget phone, taking it apart is extremely easy to a point where I usually need only one screwdriver tip for the entire teardown. To remove the battery, I'm using a thin sheet of aluminum for irrigation and dripping lacquer thinner on it, letting it flow behind the battery. In about a minute or two, the adhesive holding the battery in place will melt, and I can use the aluminum sheet to lift the battery up without bending the battery at all. I now have the rear cover, internals, and the battery separated. The only piece left to separate is the screen. I'll start in the usual way by heating the edges of the screen to soften the adhesive holding it in place. This is typically the same steps to follow for any phone, except flagship phones may use an adhesive that has more holding strength, requiring a longer heating time to soften the adhesive. I'm hoping I don't crack the screen in this video as I did in my first Lego phone video. I did make it a point to research YouTube for other A11 screen replacement videos to know exactly what to expect before attempting my screen removal. I found the research was repetitive of what I already knew, but it was nice to confirm that. I did reconnect the screen to power it up and see if I did do any damage while removing it. I was about as careful as I could have been, but it looks like the screen was still damaged during removal. Considering how careful I felt I was, I'm thinking the problem with this screen is not so much cracking, but more so I might have used too high a temperature to heat the edges. I'll continue to use this screen since it's not cracked and still works. These are the basic parts I want to break down the phone into to prep for coming up with the final design for the Lego shell. As mentioned, the rear cover will be eliminated. One thing that's different from my previous Lego phone is the flex cables extending from the back of the screen. Where my first Lego phone had only one cable with one connector on the end, this screen has two cables and three connectors on the ends. The short cable at the bottom of the screen could be a problem. Its length restricts how far away from the internals the screen can be mounted. I'll have to do some testing to see what it controls. Worst case, I'll have to use a different phone. Here's the redesigned Lego shell in LDD. It's the exact same design, but just made a little wider and longer by 2 knobs in each direction. The thickness is still the same. I made the colors blend to match what was available from the LEGO parts store. When ordering from LEGO, there are not that many colors available for the bottom and side LEGO blocks I'm using. Only the white top actually had a selection of colors, but I decided to go with something plain for now. It's LEGO and I can always change it later. I also exported the parts list from LDD to produce this listing. Using this listing, I can get onto the LEGO parts store and order everything I need by part number. The process was extremely simple. I just wish there were more colors. I'll probably go down to the LEGO store in my area and find out why it's like that, and if there's a possibility maybe they can obtain other colors. As a side note, I did look into the possibility if a complete teardown of the phone would make a difference in the size of the LEGO shell. I looked into eliminating the mid-chassis and mounting the individual parts directly to the LEGO shell. This is with the thinking that the individual parts have to fit inside the mid-chassis to begin with, so fitting them directly into the LEGO shell would save on the excess space needed for the mid-chassis. The mid-chassis measures just under 3 inches wide. The battery measures about 2 5/8 inches wide, and not like some of the other parts, cannot be trimmed to a smaller size. The main board is also 2 5/8 inches wide and can be trimmed slightly, but by nothing worth attempting. The bottom shield measures 2 3/4 inch and can be trimmed by about 1/8 inch on each side of its width. In short, since the narrowest the LEGO shell can be made would have to fit the battery, it would be about 1 knob shorter in width. Because that odd size is not part of the LEGO inventory, I'd have to cut the LEGO blocks to size. It's possible to do that and hide the cuts, but 1 knob shorter is not that much shorter considering the phone will still be huge. I'll probably save that for another video and continue on the path I'm already on. In preparation for fitting the mid-chassis into the LEGO shell, a pre-fit I did shows that the length will be oversized by about 1/16 of an inch. I'll also have to grind flat the edge with the button so that the LEGO buttons I create to push on the flex cable buttons won't be obstructed by the mid-chassis. I'll start by moving the buttons out of the way so I can grind down the protruding edge of the mid-chassis. I'm using a grinding wheel on my cordless drill to grind all edges of the mid-chassis. The mid-chassis is made of both metal and plastic, but the edge that needs to be ground down is all plastic, so it shouldn't be too hard to do even with this worn down grinding wheel. Something else I want to do to the mid-chassis is remove the rim from the side the screen mounts to. Because this face of the mid-chassis will be mounted directly to the LEGO shell, removing the rim will help reduce the overall thickness of the parts glued together. A part of the LEGO phone where this is helpful is with the short cable I mentioned earlier that protrudes from the screen and could be a problem because of its short length. Eliminating the rim on the mid-chassis will make it more likely this cable won't come up short when reconnecting it to the daughter board. I won't record removing the edge since this is optional, but as long as you know it can be removed, you can use whatever tools you have. For myself, I'm using a file. And this is the mid-chassis with the edges filed down. I was worried about the combination plastic and metal coming apart, but the plastic seems to hold in place pretty well, even after all that filing. I also removed the black sticker and paint that covered the flat area, so when it's glued to the LEGO shell, the bonded surfaces will hold a lot better. I received the LEGO pieces for the shell and put it together to test the mid-chassis fit. Once I get the mid-chassis to fit within the LEGO shell, then the next step is to confirm easy access to the items listed on the screen. By determining the design of how each item will be accessed through the thick LEGO shell, it'll also help me decide on the exact spot where to glue the mid-chassis to the LEGO shell. Some of the items will be accessible by simply drilling a hole, while other items will require a good amount of work to make them functional. A change I want to make to the shell is to put everything together in a sort of upside down order. I want to do this because the holes in the Technic blocks are closer to the top than the bottom. Because the mid-chassis will rest on the bottom of the shell, The holes in the Technic blocks will be aligned better with the mid-chassis if they are connected to the flat bottom upside down. This will change the outer texture of the shell's top and bottom to the opposite side of the Lego block, but I don't think I'll mind that look. Something else I should do to help with the short flex cable on the screen is to make the flat pieces of the Lego shell as thin as possible. Currently, the mounting knobs on both sides of the flat pieces will create a lot of distance between the screen and the mid-chassis when they are mounted on both sides. I'm going to remove all except the outer perimeter knobs on the screen side of the flat pieces to eliminate about 1/16 inch from the Lego's mounting surface. I did some testing and now have the router set up with the cutting bit adjusted to the correct height for trimming off the knobs. I'll do the trimming by eye since the trim doesn't need to be perfect. Most of the Lego surface on the screen side will be covered by either the screen or blocks that will add an accent around the edges and protection for the screen. All of this will make more sense when I get to the reassembly phase. So this is the shell with all the knobs removed except for the perimeter ones, which will serve as a connector to the trim that will surround the screen. There was damage done during the removal of the knobs. I had thought if the screen could possibly cover the damaged area when it's installed, but I don't think I'd mount the screen that close to the edge. Luckily, when I purchased the Lego parts, I ordered 2 of everything just in case. And lo and behold, just in case happened. I was able to trim the knobs off of one of the spare pieces of the same size and can now replace the damaged one with the freshly trimmed one. Now, if I fit the screen onto where it will sit on the flattened area, there's tons of room to move it around. Its final position will depend on where I glue the mid-chassis to the inside of this shell. Wherever the mid-chassis is glued, the screen has to be exactly on the other side so that all the flex cables will connect properly. Here's the current configuration so far of my Lego shell. The white Lego pieces you see are temporary reinforcements to prevent the glued together pieces along the length of the shell from bending and breaking apart. The shell will have some customized Lego pieces in the final build, but for now, I'll be using standard pieces to allow me to continue working on the construction of the phone. Before this video ends though, the phone will be fully customized with all the custom Lego pieces attached. The Lego pieces in the bag are what I'm going to use for the buttons on this phone. The Lego pieces you see are 3 cross axles, 3 bushings, and 3 half bushings. I have to glue the half bushing onto the end of the cross axle so it can act as a finger to push on the phone's flex cable push button. Because the position of the flex cable mounted outside the mid-chassis cannot be adjusted, it was easier to make the end of the cross axle as large as possible to give it more surface area to push on the flex cable button. Once the glue dries, I'll sand the end to remove any divots and make it as flat as possible. To mount the Lego buttons onto the shell, I'll slide the cross axle through the holes in the Lego block that line up with the flex cable push buttons on the phone. Connecting the full bushing on the other end of the cross axle keeps it from sliding out when there is no mid-chassis in the Lego shell. With the Lego button completed, I'll reconfirm visually that the Lego buttons are pressing in about the area of the flex cable phone buttons. For now, I can only do a visual inspection since I can't actually test functionality until I put the phone back together. When plugging a USB cable into a phone, only the metal part of the connector goes into the USB port, leaving the housing of the connector just outside the port. Now with the USB port on the phone being recessed within the Lego shell, the cutout required to allow the cable to plug into the phone's USB port would have to be as large as the connector housing, which could be unpredictable in size. The best way I could think of to get around this was to cut a hole in the Lego shell big enough to fit a specific adapter. Leave the adapter plugged into the phone's port and plug anything using the USB port into the adapter instead. The adapter will probably be glued in place to prevent it from moving around or coming loose. I've completed the modifications needed to the Lego shell so the USB port on the phone can be accessed. I tried to cut a uniform hole to fit the USB adapter, but it was hard to control the cut of the cordless drill. I eventually did get a rough hole cut that lines up well with the phone's USB port. As you can see, with the phone fitted into the shell, Its USB port lines up well with the cutout in the Lego shell, and the adapter easily plugs into the USB port. I had planned to glue the adapter in place, but now I think I'll only use the adapter when it's needed. To me, it looks a lot cleaner without a permanent USB port sticking out of the Lego shell. I've already cut the hole for the headphone adapter, similar to how I cut the hole for the USB adapter. This was a round hole, so it was a lot easier to cut. The only trouble I had was the hole is slightly offset from the existing holes in the Lego block, but luckily I got it close enough to where I could adjust while drilling and still get sort of a round hole in the correct spot. In this view, you can see the Lego block I drilled into and also the edge of the Lego plate just below it. Something I had to do different when drilling the hole for the headphone adapter was to cut it below where the lower plate connects to the block. It wasn't hard to do, just something I had to be aware of so the headphone adapter would align correctly. Another modification was to the headphone adapter. The plug didn't quite insert into the phone completely, so shaving flat one of the rounded sides to allow the adapter to push further through the Lego block and into the phone resolved that issue. When I put together the pieces up to this point, you can see the mid-chassis buttons where the red marks are line up with the Lego buttons okay. They're not centered with each other, but I think they're close enough to function properly. I won't know for sure until I have the entire phone assembled for a test run. The SIM slot is a large cutout since I'm still unsure on the mechanics of inserting and removing the SIM tray. Right now, I can get the tray out with an angle plier, but I'll have to devise something a little less primitive. When inserted all the way into the phone, the tray is recessed into the Lego by about 3/8 of an inch. The plier technique might be okay since SIMs aren't accessed very often, but I'll see if I can come up with something sleeker. In the middle is the Lego phone assembled with enough parts so work on the rear cover can be done. On the right is the original rear cover I removed from the A11 when it was first dismantled. I'll be cutting out sections from the A11 that covered the cameras and the fingerprint sensor and retrofit them onto the new rear cover. The black plastic sheet on the left is a mock-up of the new rear cover. I'm also hoping I can replace the black mock-up with a clear plexiglass version. To demonstrate how the rear cover goes on, it's basically cut to the exact size needed to fit within the frame of the Lego shell. It drops right into the frame and is held up by Lego blocks around the inside edge of the frame. Rather than making simple cutouts in the new rear cover to accommodate the cameras and fingerprint sensor, the sections that are cut out from the A11 will be attached to the new cover to help give it a more manufactured look. I'm using a utility knife and blade to cut out the sections from the A11 rear cover. My rear cover is plastic, which makes this task easy. I'm not sure how this would be done if you're using a flagship level phone with a glass rear cover. I'm cutting each section, leaving a lot of plastic around the sides, after which I'll cut each piece to a more useful size. Here's the rough cut pieces, which I'll fine tune off camera. They won't change much unless they interfere with something. This is how the cut sections will fit over the exposed electronics in the mid-chassis. The fingerprint sensor now has a larger mounting surface to mount behind the new cover. The three cameras are better aligned because without the housing from the old rear cover, each camera hangs from the end of a flex cable individually. With the housing in place, each camera is supported by a small compartment in the housing. I have to make the cutouts in the new cover so they align with the camera bump and fingerprint sensor. I'll probably use a clear sheet as a template and trace where the cutout should be, then transfer that onto the new cover. I found some transparent plastic I can use as a template to trace where the cutout should be for the camera and fingerprint sensor. I'll roughly trace onto the template enough of an outline so when doing the cutout around the outline, I can be sure the pieces that are supposed to fit in the cutout will align and fit accurately. Something I realized when I found this transparent plastic template was that it's the same thickness as the black one I plan to use as my rear cover. With there being no difference between what I was using as a template and what I had as a cover, I decided to now use the transparent template as my new cover. I couldn't help but admire the look of seeing what's inside the phone even with the cover on. With that transparency though, comes some modifications I now have to make. The sections cut from the old rear cover for the camera and fingerprint sensor were done without much thought to their visual appearance, since they weren't going to be visible, or at least not the entire cutout. Now that they are, I'll have to make them look at least a little more visually appealing. I'll be using different tools to trim the camera and fingerprint sensor covers. Basically, I want them to be smaller in size to avoid covering up anything off to their sides. Also, I want mostly straight cuts along the edges with rounded corners. The tools I'll be using to do the trimming are a handheld belt sander and a sanding block with wet-dry sandpaper. I purposely avoided saw blades because I didn't want to take a chance on the teeth of the blade snagging the plastic and cracking or tearing it. Along with the cutout for the camera and fingerprint sensor, I'll also be working on the cutout that aligns with the slots in the mid-chassis. These slots allow the cable from the screen to connect to the mother and daughter boards. These cutouts don't require much precision of alignment and size, and they'll also be hidden under much of the electronics, so I'm a lot less worried about them. These are the parts I'll be assembling to get the basic phone together so I can at least do a power on test. If it does power on, I can do the Android setup, test the volume buttons, headphone jack, and USB port. I'm a little worried about the buttons because when I press them, I don't hear the click I'd expect. The three black strips on the right side are spacers I'm using to raise the mid-chassis a little so the port extensions and buttons are better positioned in the Lego shell. I'm sticking them to the Lego shell using tape. Everything else will be held in place by pressure of the parts around it, so the only adhesive used in this initial build is on the spacers. The reason for not using any adhesive, especially on this initial build, is because I'm not sure if everything will work. Assembling everything without adhesives makes it a lot easier to disassemble if something is wrong. This next step is where I'm not real sure the short cable from the screen can reach the connector inside the phone. Right now, I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to get the cables through the slot of the Lego shell and the mid-chassis, then get the barely long enough cable connected. I'm trying both putting the screen in place and sliding the mid-chassis onto the cables, and also putting the mid-chassis in first and sliding the screen cables through the slots. Eventually, I got the short cable connected and decided to tape the screen in place so it doesn't slide around too much, which could cause the flex cable to break from the repetitive movement. With the short cable connected, the toughest part of the assembly is done and everything else should go pretty smoothly. I put the port extensions on because they'll help to keep the mid-chassis from moving around within the Lego shell while I work on the rest of the phone. At this point, I decided to put the lower shield on, which contains the speaker. 3 screws I used to hold the board in place needed to be removed because they're actually supposed to hold the shield and the board in place together. Next, I put the camera cover, fingerprint sensor cover, and the battery in place and connected the battery cable. This is when I realized I forgot about 2 wires off to the side. They connect to the motherboard, run down the side of the phone, then connect to the daughter board, which the shield is currently covering. I'll remove the shield and connect the 2 mini coax cables that run between the 2 boards. I always get nervous connecting this cable because it looks so fragile. It has a thin circular rim with a tiny wire in the middle, and I always worry I'm going to bend some part of it while trying to connect it. Once I get the connections on, I can slip the wire into a slot that holds it out of the way of other electronics. Now, all the shields can be screwed and pressed into place, followed by the mounting of the rear cover. The cutout I did in the rear cover lines up well with the camera and fingerprint sensor. Luckily, I had a good cutting tool that could be used with my handheld drill. I found some Lego pieces that will work well for holding the rear cover in place without having to glue or screw it in. The Lego pieces I found are called rails, and I'm not sure what they're for, but they work great for my purpose. I couldn't use the blocks with the knobs that are on the cover side of the block, because the knobs would be against the cover, preventing the block from pressing together with the Lego shell. Off camera, I did have to redo the buttons because when testing, they worked, but not very well. What I did here, which is hard to see, but the mid-chassis is just above the Lego shell and it has the stock buttons taped in place since I can no longer use the original shell to hold it in place. What I did instead was to cut a shelf into each Lego button to provide support for the taped on mid-chassis buttons. In testing, this worked extremely well. I did some testing on the phone's buttons, ports, camera, fingerprint sensor, and software. Everything seems to be working as expected. As you can see, I did damage this screen from the heat used to remove it, but I do have a spare that I'll eventually install. I plan to daily drive this phone for a while because I'm curious to see what it would be like to use a Lego phone for everyday life. You may have also noticed the chrome trim around the screen. That was a custom order from Chrome Block City. They have lots of chrome plated pieces that are sold brick by brick, so it can get pretty expensive, but if you're really trying to create something custom, chrome is a nice touch. I had fun building this version 2 Lego phone. When I'm done with it, it'll be displayed on my wall next to the version 1. Leave your questions and comments in the comment section below. That's all I have for now, and I'll catch you in the next video.